How does a single act of charity, cutting a military cloak in half on a cold winter day, become the defining image of Christian compassion for an entire civilization? What kind of encounter transforms a hardened Roman soldier into a monk who would rather die than harm another human being? This is the story of Saint Martin of Tours, the reluctant warrior who discovered that true strength lies not in the sword you carry but in the love you give away, even when it costs you everything. What if the greatest legacy began not with victory, but with a torn cloak? Martin's story begins at the edge of the empire and of his own transformation. Hit like and subscribe for more true accounts of how the smallest acts reveal the greatest truths. Martin was born around 316 AD in Savaria, a frontier town in Pannonia, the edge of the Roman world where civilization met the wild forests of what we now call Hungary. His father was a tribune in the Roman cavalry, a career officer who had climbed through the ranks by blood and discipline. Their home echoed with military values: duty, honor, obedience to the emperor, and reverence for Mars, the god of war. When Martin was still a boy, his father received new orders. The family moved to Pavia in northern Italy, a thriving city where Roman authority stood strong and steady. It was there, amid the marble temples and bustling forums, that young Martin first encountered something that would change his life forever: Christians. He watched them with fascination. While others worshipped with fear or calculation, Christians worshipped with joy. They cared for the sick, fed the hungry, and faced persecution with a courage that had nothing to do with swords. Martin couldn't explain it, but something in their lives called to him like a distant song. Against his father's wishes, who saw Christianity as weakness, unfit for military glory, Martin began attending catechism classes in secret. At age 10, he declared himself a catechumen, a learner preparing for baptism. His father was furious. "Christians are soft," he thundered. "They'll make you unfit for a soldier's life." But Roman law gave his father the final word. Sons of military officers were required by law to serve in the army. At age 15, despite Martin's protests, despite his growing conviction that he belonged to Christ, he was enrolled in the Imperial Horse Guard, one of Rome's elite cavalry units. The barracks became his new home. The sound of hooves on stone, the smell of leather and horse sweat, the clang of swords in practice drills, these filled his days. He took the military oath, the sacramentum, binding himself to absolute obedience. But even as he trained and served, his heart remained elsewhere. He lived simply among soldiers known for excess, took only one servant when he could have had many, and gave most of his pay to the poor. He was a soldier who dreamed of being a monk. Then came a winter morning that would change everything. Winter, 334 AD. Martin was 18 years old, stationed at Amiens in northern Gaul. He had been assigned routine patrol duty at one of the city gates, a boring task on what promised to be a miserable day. The cold was brutal. Wind cut through the streets like knives, and snow swirled in the gray morning light. People hurried past, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, heads down, breath steaming. Martin wore his white military cloak over his armor, the paludamentum, standard issue for cavalry soldiers, but also his personal property. At the city gate, huddled against the cold stone wall, sat a beggar. But sat isn't quite right. He was more collapsed than sitting, his body curled against itself in a desperate attempt to preserve warmth. He was nearly naked, his skin turned a terrible blue-gray. He shivered so violently that his teeth chattered audibly, even over the noise of the crowd. "Please," the man called out, his voice cracking. "Anything. Food. A coin. Something warm." His hand reached out toward the passing crowds, trembling in the frigid air. People looked away. Some stepped around him, as if he were a pile of refuse. Others hurried past, pulling their own cloaks tighter. "Get a job," someone muttered. A group of merchants laughed at some private joke, not even glancing down. To them, he was invisible, or worse, an inconvenience. Martin stopped. The beggar's desperate eyes met his. In that face, twisted with cold and marked by suffering, Martin saw something that made his heart catch. Not just a beggar. Not just a problem to step around. A human being. A person created in the image of God, dying right here in front of an indifferent crowd. He reached for his coin purse. Empty. He'd already given everything away earlier that week. He wore only his armor and his cloak. Military regulations were strict. He couldn't give away his armor, and technically, he wasn't supposed to give away his cloak either. It was military property. But this man was dying. Without hesitation, Martin drew his sword. The scrape of metal against the scabbard made people turn. What was the soldier doing? In one swift motion, he cut his military cloak in half. The white wool tore with a sound like a small cry. He bent down and wrapped one half around the beggar's shoulders, pulling it tight, tucking it around the man's shivering body. The beggar stared up at him, tears beginning to stream down his weathered face. "God bless you," he whispered. "God bless you." The crowd's reaction was immediate, and it wasn't gratitude. Laughter rippled through the street. "Look at the fool, soldier!" someone shouted. "He's wearing half a cloak!" People pointed and mocked. "What a spectacle! He looks ridiculous!" Even other soldiers smirked and shook their heads at this absurd display. Martin stood there in his half-cloak, the cold wind now biting through where the wool had been. His face burned with shame. He looked foolish. He knew it. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, a deep, unshakable peace. He continued his patrol wearing half a cloak in freezing weather, the object of mockery and jokes. But the beggar behind him was warm, wrapped in wool that smelled of horse and soldier, his tears mixing with the melting snow on his cheeks. He had given half, but that night, he would discover he had given everything. That evening, Martin returned to the barracks exhausted. His body ached from the cold, and his mind still echoed with the crowd's laughter. He fell into his narrow bed and into sleep almost immediately. Then the dream came, though dream seems too small a word for what happened. It was more real than waking, vivid, undeniable. He saw Christ himself standing before him, but Jesus wasn't robed in the radiant glory Martin had imagined. He was wearing the half-cloak, the torn piece of white wool that Martin had wrapped around the beggar. Surrounding him were countless angels, their faces bright with joy. Christ turned to the angels, and his voice filled all of creation. "Martin, still only a catechumen, clothed me with this garment." The words from Scripture that Martin had heard in his secret catechism classes blazed in his mind. "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." The beggar's face superimposed itself over Christ's face, and Martin understood. Every time, every forgotten person, every act of mercy or neglect, it was always Christ. Always. Martin woke with tears streaming down his face, his heart burning in his chest. He couldn't wait another day, another hour. He had to be baptized. He had to fully belong to the one who hid himself in the poor. At age 18, Martin received baptism, plunging into the waters that marked him forever as Christ's own. But there was a problem. He was still bound by his military oath. He couldn't just walk away. Roman law didn't care about religious conversions. He had enlisted for 25 years, and he had to serve. So he served. For 18 more years, he remained in the army, but everything had changed. He couldn't reconcile his growing faith with the violence of military life. How could he call himself a soldier of Christ while carrying a sword meant to kill? The crisis came in 356. Martin's unit was preparing for battle against Germanic tribes. The night before the engagement, bonuses were distributed to the troops. The donative, money meant to boost morale before blood was shed. When Martin's turn came, he stood before his commander, Julian, who would later become emperor. The coins glinted in the torchlight. "I cannot take this," Martin said, his voice steady. The tent fell silent. Julian's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I am a soldier of Christ," Martin declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I cannot fight. I cannot kill." "Coward!" Julian's face twisted with rage. "You hide behind religion to avoid battle." Martin didn't flinch. He met Julian's eyes without wavering. "Then put me unarmed in the front line tomorrow. In Christ's name, without sword or shield, I will face the enemy, but I will not kill." It was an impossible offer, certain death for an unarmed man in the front ranks, but Martin meant every word. He was willing to die. He simply wasn't willing to kill. That night, Martin prayed while others prepared weapons. The next morning, before the armies could clash, messengers arrived. The enemy had sued for peace. The battle was averted. Shortly after, Martin received his discharge. At last, after 18 years of serving Caesar, he was free to serve only Christ. He sought out Saint Hilary of Poitiers, a great bishop and teacher, and became his disciple. A soldier had become a monk, a warrior had become a servant, and his real mission was only beginning. For years, Martin lived the life he had always wanted. In 361, he founded the monastery of Ligugé, the first monastery in Gaul. It was a simple place, built by the monks' own hands, wooden cells, a small chapel, and gardens for growing food. Here, Martin could pray for hours, live in poverty, and seek God in silence. The rhythms of monastic life filled his days. Matins before dawn, the psalms sung in darkness, manual labor, digging, planting, building, silent meals, lectio divina, sacred reading. Vespers as the sun set, sleep on a hard bed in a bare cell. It was everything he wanted, nothing. But God had other plans. In 371, the Bishop of Tours died. Tours was an important city, and it needed a strong leader, someone holy, someone proven, someone the people could trust. The Christians of Tours knew exactly who they wanted: Martin. There was just one problem. Martin absolutely did not want to be bishop. He had fled the world precisely to avoid positions of power and prestige. He wanted to be hidden with Christ, not elevated above others. When he heard that a delegation was coming from Tours to ask him, he tried to refuse before they even arrived. The people of Tours, however, were not easily deterred. They sent messengers begging him to at least come and pray for a sick person in the city. It was a ruse. When Martin arrived in Tours out of charity, the whole city surrounded him. "Martin, Martin," they chanted. "We want Martin as our bishop." Martin panicked. Seeing a small building with its door slightly ajar, he ducked inside and hid. His heart pounded as he heard the crowd searching for him. Where could he have gone? They wondered. The building, it turned out, was a goose pen, and geese are not subtle creatures. As soon as Martin squeezed into the shadows, the geese began honking loudly, flapping their wings, making an enormous racket. The crowd followed the sound. They found Martin huddled in the straw among indignant geese, looking utterly miserable. Despite the absurdity, or perhaps because of it, the people were even more determined. Here was a man who truly didn't want power. That was exactly the kind of bishop they needed. Against every protest, against his deepest wishes, Martin was consecrated Bishop of Tours. Some of the other bishops sneered at his peasant appearance and rough monastic garb. "This is your great bishop?" They mocked. "He looks like a beggar." Martin accepted the mitre and the staff, but he refused to accept the luxury that came with the episcopal office. While other bishops lived in palaces, Martin founded another monastery, Marmoutier, just outside Tours, and lived there like a simple monk. He kept a small cell, ate plain food, and wore the same rough tunic. Every morning, he rose for prayer with his monks. Then he would cross into the city to shepherd his people. He had become a bishop who lived like a hermit. a leader who preferred solitude. It was the last thing he wanted, and exactly what God needed him to be. As bishop, Martin did something that had never been systematically attempted before. He brought Christianity to the countryside. In the late 4th century, cities were Christian, at least nominally. Bishops, churches, and sacraments were part of urban life. But outside the city walls, in the villages and farms and deep forests, the old gods still reigned. Sacred groves where druids offered sacrifices, stone altars stained with blood, shrines to gods whose names were older than Rome itself. The word pagan itself meant country dweller. The rural people clung to the old ways because that's all they'd ever known. Who was going to tell them about Christ? City bishops stayed in their comfortable sees. The countryside remained in darkness. Martin changed that. He walked. For years, he simply walked from village to village, often alone or with 1 or 2 companions. He would arrive in a settlement where no one had ever heard the gospel and begin to teach, slowly, patiently, person by person. His method was direct. When he came to a sacred grove or a pagan temple, he would often destroy it himself, cutting down the sacred tree or toppling the altar. The villagers would be furious, sometimes violent. But then Martin would stand on the ruins and preach about the true God, the one who loved them so much that he became human to save them. And then the miracles would come, not to show off, but to reveal Christ's power and mercy. A paralyzed child would walk after Martin prayed over her. A man possessed by demons would be freed, weeping with relief. A woman dying of fever would rise from her bed healthy. Witnesses reported that Martin even raised the dead, twice, in fact, calling back souls from the edge of eternity. The people couldn't deny what they saw with their own eyes. This rough-clad bishop with calloused hands and a gentle voice was no charlatan. God was with him. Slowly, village by village, shrine by shrine, Gaul became Christian. Martin built churches where pagan temples had stood. He ordained priests for the new Christian communities. He visited constantly, traveling on foot or by donkey, checking on the new believers, encouraging them, teaching them to pray. But Martin's mercy extended even to the debates within the church itself. When a Spanish bishop named Priscillian was accused of heresy, other bishops demanded his execution. It was the first time anyone had proposed executing someone for wrong belief rather than converting them through teaching. Martin was horrified. He argued passionately that heretics should be taught, not killed. He refused to share communion with the bishops who supported Priscillian's execution. Even when they ignored him and Priscillian was beheaded, Martin stood firm in his opposition. Mercy, he insisted, must extend even to those who are wrong. The sword had no place in matters of faith. For this stance, some called him naive, others called him weak. But Martin had long ago learned that the world's wisdom was foolishness to God. He had cut a cloak in half and been mocked for it. He had refused to kill and been called a coward. He had hidden in a goose pen and been made a bishop anyway. At every turn, God had vindicated the path of mercy. So he kept walking, kept preaching, kept building the kingdom with calloused hands and an unwavering heart. By the time his ministry reached its twilight, the countryside of Gaul had been transformed. The apostle of Gaul had lit a fire that would burn for centuries. In November of 397, Martin was 81 years old. His body, worn by decades of travel and ascetic living, was finally failing. He had been visiting a parish in Candies, a village on the Loire River, to settle a dispute among the clergy. It was quintessentially Martin, still working, still shepherding, still refusing to rest while people needed him. There, the final illness came upon him. He knew his time had come. His monks gathered around his bed, weeping openly. "Father, please don't leave us," they begged. "What will we do without you?" Martin looked at them with those eyes that had seen so much. Battlefields and beggars, sacred groves and city gates, poverty, and power. He was tired, so very tired. Heaven called to him like a welcome rest after a long journey. But then he looked at his monks again, at their tears, at their need, and he prayed the prayer that defined his entire life. Lord, if your people still need me, I will not refuse the work. Your will be done. Even at the threshold of glory, Martin was willing to stay if God asked it. But God, in his mercy, said, "Come home, beloved servant. Well done." As his breathing grew shallow, Martin asked to be placed on the bare ground, lying on a bed of ashes in the posture of penance. His monks wanted to at least give him a pillow, some comfort, but he refused. He would meet his Lord as he had lived, with nothing. His last hours were spent in prayer. His lips moved constantly, whispering the psalms he had prayed for 70 years. When the devil himself appeared, making one final attempt to claim this soul, Martin smiled weakly and said, "You have no part in me, evil one. Abraham's bosom receives me." On November 8th, 397, just after nightfall, Martin breathed his last. The room fell utterly silent. Then, one of the monks, no one later remembered who, began to sing. The others joined, their voices broken by tears, but strong with faith. They sang psalms through the night, keeping vigil over the body of the man who had taught them what it meant to be Christian. News spread rapidly. By the time they were ready to bury him 3 days later, on November 11, crowds had gathered from across Gaul. Poor people who'd received food from his hands. Pagans he'd converted, monks he'd trained, priests he'd ordained, children he'd blessed, the sick he'd healed. They came by the thousands. The funeral procession stretched for miles. They buried him at Tours, and immediately, miracles began happening at his tomb. The sick were healed, the blind saw, the possessed were freed. The shrine became one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in all of Europe. But Martin's greatest miracle wasn't what happened after he died. It was what happened that cold morning at Amiens, when a young soldier stopped and saw a beggar, when he chose mercy over mockery, when he gave half and discovered he'd given everything. Saint Martin of Tours died in 397, but his story is still being lived today, more than 16 centuries later. That image, a Roman soldier on horseback, cutting his cloak in half to give to a beggar, became the defining symbol of Christian charity in Western Europe. It was painted on church walls, carved into cathedral doors, woven into tapestries, and whispered as an example to children. Be like Saint Martin. See Christ in the poor. His feast day, November 11, became one of the most important celebrations in the medieval calendar. Martinmas marked the end of harvest and the beginning of winter, a time when communities would share their abundance with those who had little, remembering the soldier who shared his cloak. When World War I ended, the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. Some historians believe the date was chosen partly because of St. Martin's feast, a soldier saint for a war's ending, a symbol of laying down arms. Today, countless churches, hospitals, schools, and cities bear his name. San Martin, Saint Martin, Sanct Martin. His name echoes across Europe and beyond. Every time we see religious art depicting charity, we see echoes of that moment at Amiens. Every time a Christian stops to help someone in need, Martin's gesture repeats itself. But Martin's legacy isn't just historical. It's achingly relevant right now, today. We live in a world of endless need. We pass homeless people on the streets. We scroll past fundraisers and crises. We see suffering on screens and turn away, overwhelmed. There's too much. We think, I'm just one person. What difference can I make? Anything I do is just a drop in the ocean. Martin answers that paralyzing question with a torn cloak. He didn't solve homelessness in Amiens. He didn't end poverty in the Roman Empire. He helped one man, one morning, with what he had. And in that small act of seeing, really seeing, a suffering human being, He touched the face of Christ himself. The lesson isn't that we should all give away our coats, though sometimes we should. The lesson is simpler and more challenging. Stop. Look. See the person. The beggar at the gate isn't a problem to solve or avoid. They're not a statistic. They're not an inconvenience. They're a human being made in God's image, and they're a potential encounter with Christ himself. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. It's not a metaphor. It's not poetry. Christ meant it literally. He still hides in the faces of the forgotten, waiting to see if we'll stop and look. Martin also shows us that you don't need power or prestige to change the world. He was most reluctant when people tried to give him authority. He lived in a monastery cell while serving as a bishop. He walked through forests and villages, rather than hosting elegant receptions. The world calls us to climb higher, achieve more, gain influence. Martin teaches us that the greatest influence comes from descending, from choosing servanthood over status, humility over honor. And perhaps most importantly, Martin shows us that holiness and humanity aren't opposites. He hid in a goose pen. He looked foolish in half a cloak. He got cold and tired and struggled with his calling. Saints aren't perfect marble statues. They're real people who stumble and doubt and make mistakes, but who keep choosing mercy anyway. Keep stopping anyway. Keep seeing anyway. Every time you pause to help someone, you're standing at that gate in Amiens. Every act of radical, impractical, foolish generosity echoes that torn cloak. And every time you choose to see Christ in the forgotten, you're continuing the work that Martin began on a cold November morning 1600 years ago. Saint Martin of Tours, the soldier who refused to kill, the monk who became a bishop, the man who gave half and gained everything. His cloak is long gone, turned to dust centuries ago. But what it represents, the moment when eyes meet across the gap of suffering and someone chooses love, that will never fade, that lives forever. And it's waiting for you at the next corner, the next encounter, the next chance to stop and see and give. The beggar is there. Christ is there. The choice is yours. Will you stop?